one of our team members put together some items, some content for me to react to. So these are mostly Reddit stories. We'll see if I have any thoughts on them. All right. First one. HOA tried to enforce a rule that many houses in the community didn't comply with. I did some checking. It turns out that, at least in our state, if an HOA doesn't enforce a rule on everyone, it's meant to read, can't enforce the rule on anyone. And then there's a couple comments, well, that's kind of the point of a rule. If it's just used to abuse people the board don't like, it shouldn't be enforceable at all. And another comment says, I'm on an HOA board and we hire a management company to do enforcement. Every one of us has gotten a notice of non-compliance for some reason. So yeah, it's got to be fair to all. Okay, so the original poster is correct. You cannot selectively enforce rules. If you're going to enforce them, you have to enforce them equilaterally. And that can be difficult sometimes. You know, sometimes it's like a board member who's violating the rule, or we have one situation right now where it's like the person who's currently in violation is super mentally unstable, and it's, you know, just a very unfortunate and unpleasant circumstance to have to enforce them on this rule. But it's true. If you're going to enforce a rule, you have to enforce it equally. And if you're not going to enforce it equally to everybody all the time, then you can't enforce it at all. So that is 100% correct. Let's see what else we got. The condo association wanted to renovate the pool and pitch the costs they were moving forward with. There were a lot of developers in the building, and they noticed that it was about 4 times the cost that it should have been. Association says tough cookies. Things get fun. People writing notices of what's going on with the association writing emails about it, lots of snipping back and forth. Then one day I'm in the lobby waiting for someone to show up, and the head of the association and one of the people calling them out ran into each other, and they had to immediately get separated by security because they were about to start throwing punches. And then someone comments, probably somebody of one of the HOA leaders that owns the pool reno company. Pool company buddy gets twice the normal fee. HOA buddy pockets half the total cost. That's what everybody expected. So inflated costs, we see that a lot. Usually by people firing their management company and hiring us. But I wish it were not as common in the HOA space. I mean, well, I'd probably be a much smaller outfit if it were less common. But yeah, the reality is that the ideas of kickbacks and using a family member or preferred vendor contractor that inflates the price, that is a thing. Now, on the flip side of it, you know, I have seen legitimate circumstances where during COVID or after COVID, the costs of everything just went up so much that someone who used to be a contractor even 10 years ago looks at the price of what the HOA is paying for a specific project and saying, oh, that's way too much. And it's not. It's just the reality of where the economy is today and what construction costs are today. But when you're talking about like 4 times the actual cost, yeah, there's definitely someone getting kickbacks. I see it a lot. I have contractors approach me, like when I'm getting bids, and be like, hey, how much do you want me to write into this contract for you? You know, we don't do that, but it's ubiquitous enough in the industry that contractors know to ask that question. This is why you need to be involved in your HOA. Now, there's right ways and wrong ways to go about rectifying that situation, and we get into that in, you know, our training program and other videos we do. But I've seen it where cost to get certain stuff done is inflated because of a relationship. So yeah, I believe it, but I do not condone it. Another one we got. I have 3, okay? 2 about me, 1 about my neighbor. I moved into a new construction neighborhood after picking out all the bells and whistles for the dream house. About 2 years after I moved in, the garbage truck managed to destroy the garbage cans somehow. The sanitation company replaced it. But in the time between the trash account being set up and the mishap, the sanitation company changed the color and style of the cans they provided. My HOA told me that my garbage can was unauthorized and could not be left on the street on trash day because it was visually detracting. Interesting. I went to the city sanitation and explained what was going on. They told me that they didn't maintain the old stock of can and they had switched over the new one, and then the old ones ran out. So I had to take a letter from them back to the HOA, who would not budge and told me that I needed to have the same kind of can as everybody else. Everybody had their can in the same place on the same side of each house when it wasn't trash day. So I ended up having to put the new can in the backyard and wheel it around the house at the exact moment that the trash showed up, and immediately wheel it back to the backyard. I had to make special arrangements with work to be able to do this every Monday. Wow. I believe this. I believe that this has happened. There's so many questions I have. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's completely unreasonable. There has to be another way. Like, it's a valid situation. There has to be another way to rectify it. There's a human element to all of this, right? Like there's certain things that are out of the control of this unit owner. And he's done his due diligence, or she's done her due diligence, whoever it is, to get a letter from the sanitation company and do all the right things. I think there's a simple solution here. Try to match the color as closely as possible. Get a color sample, go to Home Depot, get some paint and just paint the new can the old color. If it's really that much of an eyesore, that's the easiest and lowest cost solution. If they're going to be super difficult about it, I think that there is a human element that we have to consider. And just like, there's sometimes people are just unreasonable. It's a difficult situation, but there has to be a better way than to just, make this person interrupt their whole life just to put the trash out on a Monday. Boards that are going to be super litigious like that and super, what's the word I'm looking for? They're following the rules to the letter and they're not budging on it. They're just unreasonable in that respect. You got to be careful because you may not be in your position for long if you piss enough people off. Right? It's a democratic process. I just did a podcast on it with an association that we had similar issues with. As a board member, you're there to serve the community. I get it. Like they're all brown cans and this guy has a blue can and it just looks funny, right? When everybody's putting their trash out and everything wants to look the same. But by the same token, there's got to be a better way to solve the issue. All right. This person says, context, I had the house built in 2002. I had a 1998 Chevy SUV, which was 4 years old. I received a letter from the HOA that my vehicle, which didn't have a single dent, scratch, or paint blemish, and was washed and tire dressings applied weekly, was an eyesore and couldn't be parked in my driveway. The letter referred to it being a disabled junker. Granted, I live in a neighborhood of Mercedes, BMW, and Range Rovers, but it definitely wasn't in the class of junk. So I had to park my truck in the garage, and every time I needed to leave, I had to play musical cars with my then wife. Oh man, I wish I had a picture of the car to see. I think that might be too far. If the car's operational and registered, it's their vehicle, it's their personal property. Like as long as it's not violating a law or a rule. I definitely know of some HOAs that all the vehicles have to be registered. You can't have a disabled vehicle parked on in the common elements. If it's just like an ugly car, I don't think you can enforce that, honestly. Depends how bad it is, like rust holes everywhere, mismatched paint job. I don't know. Even then, like I would never think to make someone remove a vehicle because I thought it was ugly. And we have some pretty nice associations. That just doesn't seem right. And to say it's an eyesore is very subjective. And any HOA in case law, like it needs to be an objective standard. You can objectively demonstrate that the vehicle is inoperable, right? It doesn't move, it doesn't turn on, whatever. You cannot objectively determine what is an eyesore. Is it an eyesore to that one board member? What are we talking about? This is why HOAs get bad raps. All right, next. HOA of my neighborhood tried to tell me that my house needed to be added onto because houses need to be at least 800 square feet in my neighborhood. My house is 1,750 square feet. HOA was started in 2004. My house was built in 1989. My family took the HOA to court. To make a long story short, HOA had to back down because their rules didn't exist until after the house was built. So the HOA rules do not apply to my house. Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like they built an HOA around pre-existing houses. And if that's the case, like those houses are grandfathered in, unless there's a stipulation when like the declarant purchases the land and files it with the town. But what's filed on town record, what's filed in the declaration is going to spell all this out of the definitions and boundaries and all that stuff. But the developer can't turn it over in a condition that's like unenforceable, that's in violation. So that's an interesting case. I would agree with the court's decision on that. If that's in case, the facts of what happened. Yeah, you built an HOA around a house. Things get grandfathered in all the time. Next up, I slipped in my driveway and fell and broke my femur near my hip and couldn't get up. I was laying in my driveway calling for help for about 30 minutes and I could hear people walking past, but nobody stopped for quite a while. I eventually asked someone to call an ambulance as my phone was in my car and out of reach and got taken care of. Spent a few days in the hospital, and when I got home, I had a letter from my HOA saying I was in violation for sleeping in my driveway in the middle of the day. So the people who walked by and definitely heard me calling for help and didn't stop were from the HOA and reported me to them. What in the world? That's wild. Oh my God. I thought this was going to be like a slip and fall lawsuit type thing. That's crazy. So there's this book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. I picked it up because a guy I follow, Alex Hormozy. If you're into entrepreneurship and business, check him out. He's awesome. But he's got a short list of recommended reading, and one of them is this book called Influence. And it was a bunch of books in that his like recommended reading that I would have never like thought to look up. But I read this book, and it turns out to be really, really good. And I don't think I would have ever picked it up had he not recommended it. But it's all about the group psychology and psychology of decision-making and influence on people. And one of the things that they talk about in that book was there was a case, I think it was in New York, where this lady was like chased around by a murderer, like an assailant, for like 30 to 40 minutes. And she was in the street screaming and being chased, and she like escaped. And then long story short, she ended up getting like murdered in the woods after like this huge long ordeal. And upon investigation, the cops found out that there was 38 different people who saw this occur, and like neighbors like looking out the window, seeing this happen. And they all saw it occur, and none of them even thought to call the cops. None of them intervened. None of them did anything. And what the assertion or the thesis was that the social indicators, because the neighbors like saw it happening, and the neighbors saw other neighbors seeing it, and no other neighbor was doing anything about it, everybody just assumed that it was fine, it was okay, it was normal. It wasn't a dire situation. And it was like these social cues that everybody was picking up on from each other that resulted in the person not being helped and ultimately dying. And so in the book, he recommends like specific things that you do, like you direct your attention or your remarks to one person. You say, "You in the brown shirt, can you help me? I think I've broken my leg," or whatever the case is, right? If you just rely on a group of people, if nobody in the group sees anybody else going to help you, the social pressure is to not help you. And it was a really interesting like psychological study. It's not, I don't condone this. This is terrible. And it's crazy that the people who walked by just assumed she was sleeping in her driveway. Like, I don't know what her MO is or like the type of person she is. I think it's wild that the HOA or these people reported her to the board, or that they were on the board and just chose not to help her. That book changed my perspective or my perception on this, because it's like, wow, that really does happen, where people don't see others responding to an emergency situation. They just assume it's not an emergency, and it can be. Let's see. Everyone had to drag their trash bins down a hill to a curb where the garbage truck would pick it up. People would be slow to get their bins back after pickup. So the HOA went and dragged all the bins to the other side of the neighborhood and threw them in a pile in a random patch of public grass. So we pay these people to be childishly petty and antagonize us, and their punishment, quote unquote punishment, only created more of an eyesore than the bins uniformly lined up on a curb. You know, people are weird, man. It's surprising that we all like live around each other and we don't have more confrontations than we do. Cause like the more I'm around people and deal with people, the more I realize that people are just a little wacky. So this is actually a more nuanced one, kind of tricky. So the HOA has this rule, and they are kind of enforcing their rule in probably not the correct way. Like the next question I have is, who technically owns the trash bin, the owners or the HOA? If the HOA owns them, like they could technically not be breaking any laws by doing that. Is it petty? Absolutely. How long were they out there, right? Because I've been guilty. I live in a neighborhood it's a nice neighborhood, but it's happened more than once where I've left my trash cans at the curb for like 2 days. I'm very busy. I work a lot of hours a week, and I just haven't done it, right? I would be pretty salty if my neighbor went and threw my trash can in some other property down at the end of the street. The neighborly thing to do, especially if you're on an HOA board, put someone's trash back for them. That's the neighborly thing to do. They will forever be indebted to you. They'll be super grateful. Anytime you need a vote, anytime you need anything done, they're going to be like, damn, I didn't do what I was supposed to do, and I left my trash can at the end of the driveway, and this person was kind enough to put it back for me. Now, if they're doing that every week, then they might get kind of annoyed by that, but I would hope that after the first or second time that your neighbor kindly put your trash back for you, you saw it on your Ring camera, and you're like, oh man. If I'm in that position, I'm like, wow, I'm a real piece of crap. I left it out so long that my neighbor went and put it back for me, and I would make sure that I'm bringing my trash in sooner. So there's better ways to get the most favorable results. Ultimately, you want to build rapport with your neighbors, especially if you're on the board. You are in an elected position, right? Do good things for them and with them and serve them, and they will be undyingly loyal to you. But to take everybody's trash can and throw them in, like, that's a little much. Next up, reacting to this. My wife and I bought our condo almost 6 years ago. and the guy we bought it from had owned it for less than a year. When we closed, he said he had never got a key to the neighborhood pool when he bought the place from the previous owner, but he was old, so didn't care and was never going to use it. We said, no big deal. We'll just ask for a new one. Well, the HOA wants us to pay $300 for a quote unquote new key because we lost our old one. And it's some fraud prevention measure to stop people from selling their pool keys or something. We had told them immediately after moving in, we never got a key, and after 6 years, they refused to get us one. We just picked the lock and go in anyway. But if it was an issue, I'd be furious at the ridiculousness of making us pay into the HOA to maintain the pool when we never got access to it, even though it wasn't our fault and probably not even the fault of the guy before us. And someone comments, look, I get it's hard to justify paying $300 for a key, but there is a reason. What they should do is have the lock rekeyed and issue new keys to everyone, as a lost key is a security and safety issue. $300 is the cost of bringing in a locksmith and issuing the new keys. This is one where I understand where the HOA is coming from. I think they could use a little more discretion, but we don't know this community. I have communities where it's a legitimate problem. Like at the community I'm thinking of, it's with gate remotes, gate clickers, because it's in a city and there's not a lot of parking. And so people would sell their gate clickers. People would come in, break into cars, steal gate clickers or parking passes. They would sell their parking passes. So like at that association, there's a rule where a replacement parking pass is $150. You can bring the old parking pass all jacked up and destroyed and whatever, but as long as it's there, then we'll issue you a new one for free. But if it's a quote unquote lost pass, like we're going to assume you sold it to someone or just parking an extra vehicle in the lot, which is already full. There's a high price tag on it to deter people from doing that. And it's this tricky situation because there are sometimes real circumstances where someone gets their remote stolen. So there are real situations, but a lot of times the HOA is just trying to make the best of a bad situation. And if there's a nice pool and people are loaning their keys out or giving their keys to their friends, or their friends are losing their keys, I can see why they have a $300 replacement fee, because they're assuming that you gave your extra key to your friend or family member and they're going to come use the pool when you're not around. And a lot of times that's what's happening. So they put this measure in place to deter people from doing that. That said, I think most states are like this, but I know Connecticut is. When you convey a property in an HOA or you buy or sell a unit, there has to be what's called a resale certificate. So people put in requests for a resale certificate or resale package, and we provide that. So we know when units are getting sold. If this request came in shortly after a unit being sold, I think there might be an area for discretion. Maybe you charge them like a fraction of that price, $50 or $20 or whatever it is. There's still a cost incurred to go get the key made though. We have gate remotes and the gates only hold so many codes to so many remotes. So like once you issue enough new remotes, you've got to wipe the codes from the gate and reprogram everybody's remote, which is a whole day endeavor. And it's like close to $1,000 in labor, or, at least many hundreds of dollars in labor to have someone out there checking tags, reprogramming everybody's remote. It's a whole thing. There's other factors, and people just look at it like, oh, it doesn't cost $300 to get a new key. No, it doesn't. But there is a lot more work than you may realize involved in getting you a new key, depending on that lock, that structure, how that thing is set up, right? It might not just be as easy as going and getting a copy of a key made. So that's something that you might have recourse to go back to the attorney or whoever did the closing. Now, if you don't know about it till after closing, it might be an issue. But if you know about it before closing and the previous owner lost the key, and he might have just said that he never got it from a previous owner. I don't know. He was old, right? He might have just lost the key. If that's a known item beforehand and you know that there's going to be a substantial replacement cost, then that should be resolved at closing. And there should be a closing credit going one way or the other to make up for that, even if you guys split the cost of it. That's a long-winded answer, but that situation is actually more nuanced and complicated than it lets on to be. Next one. Drones were used to make sure no one was growing vegetables in their backyards. No parking along the street in front of your house. Garbage cans had to be brought in within 15 minutes of pickup, though that was a different time each week. My neighbor was sued and lost after replacing their old windows. The new frames were the wrong shade of eggshell cream. And then there's a comment, drone surveillance to detect unlawful tomatoes. That's an extra level of psycho. This is what happens when little people get a little bit of power. Oof. So this one's weird because there's some items in here that I think are completely unreasonable, and there's others that are reasonable. All right, so this is one that like I think is valid. When you replace your windows, you have to check with the HOA to make sure that you are replacing with the correct product. And a lot of times people just do it and they don't check. They don't check with the HOA. They don't get any guidance. They don't get any clearance. They just go ahead and do it. Now, in an HOA, part of the thing is that everything has to match. You can definitely get sued for replacing your slider window and not matching the color correctly. I don't know how much it was off, but even if it's off like a few shades, if it looks weird, like if you see it, like if you have all these windows are one shade and then these two are a different shade, that looks terrible. So yeah, you got to fix it. You got to paint it. You got to fix it. You got to replace it. I don't know, but I don't know what the solution is for them, but you just can't leave it like that because that's ugly and it could have been avoided. I'm sure it could have been avoided if the unit owner just reached out to the management company or the board and asked. The other stuff, drones were used to make sure no one was growing vegetables in their backyards. If that's a violation of the rules and regs and it's happening a lot, then the rules are the rules. If they enforce it via drone, like it's actually kind of clever, but it depends on the community and what's important to them. There's this interesting thing. Like if you look at Myers-Briggs personalities, you know, there's 16 core personality types and there's really successful companies who like make you test what your Myers-Briggs is before joining the company. And then they just put you in a role that you're good at. So like people like that are really good in analytical data entry roles, data gathering roles, analysis, you know, stuff that requires rigid, you know, regimented approaches. There's certain professions that require that. And there's people and personalities that is like fundamentally important to them. And a lot of times they're buying in an HOA because of the uniformity, because of the rules and regulations in place to govern these types of things. And a vegetable garden might seem like an innocuous thing, but if this is the type of person that their whole personality is based on structure and rules, then regardless of whether it's hurting anybody or whether people don't like it, it's in violation of the rules. And on principle, they have to act on it. And it doesn't make them bad people. It just makes them different. You know, you might be someone who's a little more loosey-goosey or just like we kind of fly by the seat of our pants. And as long as it's not hurting anybody, it's fine. That's not inherently better or worse than someone who's super structured and rigid. You need both in life and society. You don't want your airplane mechanic to be a super loosey-goosey guy. You don't want your pilot or the regulatory agency of who you're flying on your commercial jet to be just kind of like, you know, oh yeah, it'll probably be fine. You know, like there's a lot of people in this world that are like that. You don't want them in certain roles. As a community in your HOA, you get to select the type of people you want leading your community, right? And regardless of whether you agree with the rule or not, the rule is the rule. And they are allowed to enforce it. And if they're enforcing it equally and they're flying drones to make sure they can enforce it equally, it's fine. If you don't agree with it, get on the board, do something about it. If you can't get on the board, campaign with your neighbors. If enough of you are pissed off about it, then fine. But if you're like one of two people in your community that are growing gardens in the backyard and everybody else is like, no, this shouldn't be happening, then, you know, as someone else said in one of these comments, tough cookies, or go, you know, purchase a property where you can do what you want to do. No parking along the street in front of your house. I understand that. Like if that's a rule, that's a rule. Deal with it. The only one that I have issues with is garbage cans had to be picked up within 15 minutes. That's a little much. You're assuming everybody has the same schedule and that everybody can do it. Now, I think that there's a creative solution to it. I think if you have good relationships with your neighbors can just help you out. But here's the thing. We're talking about one commenter, 4 different issues. After pulling it apart, I think this person's probably just a person who likes to do what they like to do. And they don't think it's fair that they can't do that in an HOA. I think this HOA or this board's probably a little more rigid or structured than I would like, but they've been elected to serve the community. They've been elected by the community to be in their roles. And if the community doesn't like that as a whole, then get them out. All right, another poster says, we live in a historic district, so the HOA is super strict about the exterior of our homes. Our patio door was warped, so we spent forever trying to find the exact same style/color antique door to replace it. As soon as we did, they got pissed that we didn't get approval first. The only way you would even know we swapped it was if you were watching when it happened. Then there's a commenter said, I had a teacher who lived in one of the historic districts in Baltimore, so the regulation was that you can only paint the door of the house in colors that were common in the colonial period. So his neighbor painted the exterior of his house chartreuse. The HOA freaked out because of how obnoxious it looked, but it was within the regulations. That's really funny. Chartreuse is like, if I'm thinking you have green chartreuse and yellow chartreuse, but I'm guessing it was a pretty bright, floral color. That's hysterical. Then you got to be specific when you write these regulations, or people will take advantage of loopholes you leave. That's clever. So as far as the door itself, get it approved. How hard is it to just check with the HOA? American culture is always at odds with HOA life, because HOA life is all about common good and like being uniform with everybody else. And that's like what the HOA is set up to be. And American culture and values is about autonomy, independence and autonomy, and freedom of thought and speech, and like being your own person. It's a big American value. So like there's two things that are fundamentally at odds when you choose to live in an HOA. You're going to swap out your deck door. You know that people could potentially have issue with it. It could cost you a lot of money if you do it the wrong way and they make you replace it. Like that's the law. It's the law. Don't just assume that you're doing the right thing and you're good to go. Just get it cleared. It's super easy and way easier, because then, you know, the board, especially if you have a board that's always home or always around, they're going to get in a tiffy because nobody checked with them before they did it. And maybe you guys did it the right way, but there's a lot of people who aren't doing it the right way. So it's a sensitive subject. So just get it checked by the HOA. And they go, yeah, you wouldn't even know if it was changed unless you were watching it happen. Well, guess what? The board's watching. That's what many of them feel their job is. They need to monitor and police these things, right? So just do your part, check with them. It makes them feel good, right? You don't have to worry about it because you got to not only check with them, get the approval in writing. Protect yourself. All right. Next up, at the start of COVID, our 8-home HOA treasurer stopped collecting dues. No invoices, no reminders, nothing. It's a 3-year term that's almost up, and there's no telling what's going to happen when/if they change treasurers. Nobody seems to mind or even really talk about it. Everyone just seems to enjoy the extra $125 a quarter in the bank account. There's plenty in the HOA account to cover the expenses and insurance for years to come. It's me. I'm the treasurer. Oh my goodness. Woo, plot twist. Oh, that's funny. It's me. I'm the treasurer. Best response yet. The last comment says, electricity for the streetlights and some insurance policy for God knows what. I used to pay for maintenance of a common area, but we all just pitch in and take care of it ourselves now. I honestly can't tell if I'm the best HOA treasurer of all time or the worst. Oh man. This is really funny. So it's an 8-home HOA, probably a little PUD, a little subdevelopment. I don't even know. Like, ask your neighbors you guys, it's an 8-home community. Talk to your neighbors, find out if they're good with it. If you're the treasurer and you guys are in good financial shape, then fine. You know, you're not really putting away for reserves, but as long as your bills are covered, I mean, you might get in trouble because like ultimately you have a fiduciary duty to the community to do your job. And if the community has voted on a specific budget, then you are accountable to collect the dues for that budget. That's the legal answer. If the community voted on a budget, then you have to collect the dues for the budget. That's your role as the treasurer. That's your fiduciary role. If you don't live up to that, someone could sue you. Now, it's 8 homes. If everybody's good with it, then just get everybody to agree to that and be like, hey, we're not going to collect dues because of COVID. Like, everybody okay with this? We got money in the bank. Everybody's fine. Then let it ride. But like, ultimately, when the treasurer changes, if everybody's 2 years behind on dues, then yeah, they can come back and try to collect dues for everybody and enforce late fees. And they could feel that they're doing their fiduciary responsibility by doing that. And they would be right. It all depends on the personality. But the legal answer is just talk to your neighbors, make sure everybody's on the same page. And whatever you're doing, just make sure everybody's cool with it. Another comment. When I was married, we bought a house in a new construction neighborhood. When buying the home, we were informed that the developer would have full control of the HOA, including funds, until the neighborhood was done being built, at which time the homeowners would take control. We thought it wasn't a big deal, just be patient for a year or so. Well, the developer keeps buying acreage adjoining the neighborhood to expand it. 6 years later, the neighborhood is still expanding with the developer in charge of the HOA. Potholed streets, weeds and overgrowth, a dilapidated pool, etc. Not to mention the probable misuse, stealing of funds. There's a comment. Developer collects HOA fees while expanding, fails to provide services. Once they can't expand anymore, they simply go bankrupt, quote unquote, go bankrupt or whatever. abscond with the money and leave you all with crumbling infrastructure. Unfortunately, that's true. Developers, construction companies are notorious for going out of business. Their role in life is to maximize their own profits, right? The developers, they're out there to make money. I don't know if you knew this, but developers are not out there with the intention of making sure that they give you a perfect product. The developer is out there to make sure that their investment grows by as much as possible. So if they're spending money, time, resources on a project, they are in it just for the money. If they are an unscrupulous individual or entity in any way, then all they care about is they don't care about reputation. They don't care about anything else. They go bankrupt afterwards. Some of it, it's part of their planned business model. Now, it sounds like some promises were made as far as when it would be turned over and what would be the scope of the project. It's in the declaration. You should always make sure that that stuff is outlined in writing and have an attorney review it. If the developer is still in charge of the HOA and they're still collecting dues from everybody and they're not fixing the stuff that needs to be fixed, then they're definitely exposing themselves to a lawsuit. Most developers have bonds, right? A good way you can screw them is to call in the bond, right? Get together, file a lawsuit, get a good attorney who specializes in condo law, sue the developer, and call in the bond. And if the developer is still constructing, they're still operating, and their bond gets called in, guess what? They're going to lose their bond, and then they're going to lose their ability to continue construction. And they're going to stop buying land and building because now they're involved in a lawsuit and their bond company, the insurance company, is no longer going to insure them. And then they're really risking, either personal exposure or immediate bankruptcy if there's a lawsuit. So you can kind of force their hand, but you gotta find out what promises were in writing or you got to be able to prove that they're not doing their fiduciary duty to the community by fixing the infrastructure as it's failing. But it happens all the time where developers run out of money mid-project or whatever. And it sounds like if they're just bad with money and they're bad with managing this whole situation, this whole project, then it sounds like they're going to run out, at some point they're going to run out of money and the HOA is going to be there and have to pick up the pieces. And that happens all the time. HOAs are just a precarious business to be in. You just got to make sure it's being done the right way. That's why you hire people like us. That's why you hire good, reputable vendors and management companies and people you can trust to help you navigate these situations. It's important. Good manager, good attorney, good accountant. Again, it's a democratic process. It's a legal process. Campaign, get support from your fellow neighbors and go make a change or else you're going to lose a lot of money. I think this is the last one. Not a horror story, but we had a snowstorm that dumped about 6 feet of snow on us overnight. It was garbage day that morning. So our full dumpster was sitting at the road waiting to be picked up, completely covered in snow, as was everything else. And no one could get their garbage cans. The snowstorm turned into ice storm, which took everything outside hostage. 6 inches of solid ice on everything, cementing the dumpsters in place. The next day, the ice and snow melted just enough to see the lids, but they were still buried. Trash pickup was delayed because they couldn't get the trucks through the snow because the HOA didn't include plowing our community streets. The next morning, we got a notice emailed to us about how our garbage had been sitting out there for 3 days and it needed to be moved immediately or we could pay a fine. They literally did nothing positive at all ever. Total thievery. Yeah, that's a tough situation. I don't know, man. That's a tough one to comment on, not being there. Again, a lot of these comments, we're getting one person's perspective of it. But if everything's under 6 inches of ice, then there should be some discretion, right? You're going to make everybody, nobody can pick it up. However, I will say this, if this is the one person that had their garbage out there and they're chronically, habitually leaving it out there and the snowstorm was coming, it was all over the news and, trash pickup day was 3 days before the storm and they just left it out there and then it got iced on and now it's impeding other traffic flow and it's causing a big issue and they're the only ones with their trash can outside under 6 inches of ice, then I understand why the HOA is getting on them about this, right? I don't know them. I don't know the situation. It could be reasonable. It could not be reasonable. As with anything in an HOA, you have to get all the facts and you have to know both sides and then make a informed decision. And a lot of times it's just like you making a judgment call. And the moral of that story is I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. That's funny though. It's a funny situation. Probably annoying for everybody involved. But anyways, reactions to Reddit threads. I think we had fun with that one. We should do that again.